The table had been set for 14, and every placement was deliberate. Mrs. Ord knew this because she had watched the Dowager Duchess arrange it herself. Not through instruction to the footman, not through a written card left the silver tray key in the butler's pantry, but with her own hands, moving the place cards across the mahogany as though positioning figures on a chessboard. The Dowager had arrived in the dining room at 3:30, 2 full hours before the dressing bell, wearing her afternoon silk and an expression that permitted no questions. She had stood at the head of the table and studied the existing arrangement. The one Gresham had laid according to precedent, with the new Duchess seated at the Duke's right hand, and she had dismantled it with the quiet efficiency of someone correcting a child's arithmetic. The family places remained, Lord and Lady Ashton at the center, Sir Philip Carew and his wife opposite, the Dowager herself at the foot, as she had sat for 23 years. But the place card bearing the name Frances Selborne, Duchess of Westmere, written in the secretary's careful copperplate not 3 weeks earlier, the Dowager lifted between 2 fingers and carried the length of the room, past the epergne, past the family silver, past the last of the upholstered chairs, and set it down at the very end of the table, in the section where the household's senior staff would take their supper once the family had been served. It was not, technically, the servants' table. The dining room at Brindle Park was arranged in the old style, one continuous table of dark oak that ran nearly the full length of the room, with the family occupying the upper portion nearest the fireplace, and the senior household staff permitted to eat at the lower end on formal evenings when numbers required it. The Dowager had not placed her daughter-in-law with the scullery maids. She had placed her in the gray territory between, close enough to the housekeeper's customary seat that the insult could be read, far enough from the kitchen passage that it might, if challenged, be called an error of spacing. Mrs. Ord, who had served the Selborne family for 11 years and the Dowager for every one of them, recognized the placement for what it was. She said nothing. She had learned, in her first year of service, that the Dowager Duchess did not make errors of spacing. Frances Selborne had been Duchess of Westmere for 19 days. She had been a clergyman's daughter for 22 years before that, the eldest, child of Reverend Martin Thurlow, who held the living at St. Dunstan's in the village of Hartwell, 17 miles from the Westmere estate and a world removed from its drawing rooms. She had grown up in a rectory with damp in the east wall and more books than furniture, educated by her father in Latin and by her mother, before her mother's death when Frances was 14, in the particular art of entering rooms where one was not entirely welcome and behaving as though one belonged there. It was this quality, more than any other, that had drawn the Duke's attention. Not her beauty, which was real but quiet, brown hair that caught auburn in certain light, a steady gray gaze, a mouth that settled naturally into an expression of composed attention. Not her fortune, which was non-existent. Not her connections, which consisted of a father who read Greek for pleasure and a younger brother studying divinity at Cambridge on a modest scholarship. What had drawn Lawrence Selborne across the assembly room at Harrowfield, past the daughters of 3 earls and a baronet's widow who had been pursuing him with undisguised determination for 2 seasons, the sight of Frances Thurlow listening to Lady Ashton describe the failures of her milliner with an expression of such grave, intelligent sympathy that he had mistaken her, for one startling moment, for someone who actually cared about the milliner. She did not care about the milliner. He discovered this within 4 minutes of conversation. What she cared about was people's dignity, their right to be heard without mockery, even when what they said was foolish. She listened to Lady Ashton because Lady Ashton wished to be listened to, and because Frances understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent her life on the margins of rooms she had not been born to occupy, that the smallest courtesies were the ones that mattered most. He had called on her father 3 times before proposing. The first visit, Reverend Thurlow had served him tea in chipped cups and discussed the epistles of St. Paul with a rigor that left the Duke, a man accustomed to the intellectual languor of London drawing rooms, genuinely engaged for the first time in months. The second visit, Frances had been out walking and the Duke had waited an hour and a half in the rectory parlor, reading a volume of Cowper's poetry he found on the windowsill, until she returned with mud on her boots and an armful of wildflowers she had. gathered for the church altar. The third visit he had proposed in her father's study, standing beside the desk where Reverend Thurlow wrote his sermons, and Francis had looked at him for a long moment and said, "You understand that I come with nothing," and the Duke, who had never before been at a loss for a precisely calibrated response, had said, "You come with everything that matters," and meant it so completely that he had startled himself. They had married quietly at St. Dunstan's, with her father officiating and the Duke's mother absent. The Dowager had sent a note citing a headache. It was the first of her arrangements. The second had been the matter of Francis's rooms, the Duchess's apartments at Brindle Park, a suite of 3 south-facing chambers with views across the lake, had been occupied by the Dowager since her own husband's death 8 years earlier. When Frances arrived as a bride, she found herself installed in the north wing, in a set of rooms that were perfectly adequate and entirely without warmth, their windows overlooking the stable yard. The Dowager had not moved. No one had asked her to. The Duke had been away in London for the first 4 days of Francis's arrival at the estate, a matter in the House of Lords that could not be delayed, and by the time he returned, the arrangement had calcified into fact. Frances had said nothing about the rooms. She had hung her mother's watercolor of the Hartwell churchyard above the writing desk, placed her books on the shelf nearest the window where the light was best in the morning hours, and written her father a letter describing the grounds in terms so generous that Reverend Thurlow, reading it in his study with a cup of tea gone cold beside him, had set down the page and removed his spectacles and sat very still for several minutes. The third arrangement was the seating. Frances learned of it when she came down to dinner. She had dressed carefully, the dove-gray silk that had been her wedding gift from the Duke, chosen by herself at his insistence, modest in cut but beautifully made, with the pearl drop earrings that had belonged to his grandmother and which he had presented to her on the morning after their wedding with a tenderness that had startled them both. Her hair was dressed simply. She wore no other ornament. She had learned, in 19 days, that ornament in the Dowager's presence functioned as a provocation, an assertion of status that the Dowager would meet with a glance so perfectly calibrated between pity and amusement that Frances had taken to wearing less each evening rather than more. The dining room was already occupied when she entered. Lord and Lady Ashton stood near the fireplace with Sir Philip and his wife. The Dowager sat in her customary chair at the foot of the table, her posture a study in architectural precision, spine aligned, shoulders level, chin raised to the exact degree that conveyed authority without visible effort. She wore black silk, as she had every evening since her husband's death, and a single rope of pearls that caught the candlelight with each controlled breath. Gresham, the butler, stood near the sideboard with an expression of such rigid neutrality that Mrs. Ord, watching from the passage, understood immediately that he had seen the revised placement and been instructed, either by word or by the weight of 23 years' service, to say nothing. Frances crossed the room, greeted the guests with the composure her mother had taught her, and looked for her place. She found it. There was a moment Mrs. Ord saw it, Gresham saw it, and the Dowager, who missed nothing, certainly saw it, when Frances's step faltered. Not a stumble, not a visible break, a hesitation so brief that anyone not watching for it would have missed it entirely. The fractional pause of a woman who has just understood something and is deciding, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, how to carry it. Frances carried it to her chair. She walked the length of the table without hurrying, without looking back at the family places she was passing, without glancing at the Dowager. She reached the seat beside the place laid for Mrs. Ord, the housekeeper's own supper place, marked by the simpler china and the absence of a wine-glass, and she sat down. She unfolded her napkin. She placed it in her lap. She looked up at Mrs. Ord, who had come to take her own seat with the uncertain gait of someone approaching an object that might detonate, and she said quietly, "Good evening, Mrs. Ord. I do hope the preparations have not been too taxing." Mrs. Ord sat down. Her hands were not entirely steady. "Not at all, Your Grace." Palliser, the steward, took his seat on Frances's other side. He was a man of 50, deliberate in all things, and he sat with the careful precision of someone lowering himself into a bath of unknown temperature. He did not look at the Dowager. He did not look at Frances. He looked at his plate. The Duke had not yet come down. Frances sat among the household staff and waited. The footman began to serve. She accepted soup. She held her spoon correctly. Reverend Thurlow had been particular about table manners, having dined twice in his youth at the bishop's table and carried the memory forward as gospel. And she ate with the unhurried calm of a woman, taking supper in her own dining room, which in every legal and ecclesiastical sense it was. The dowager watched from the foot of the family table. Her expression had not changed. It would not change for the duration of the evening. That was part of the calculation. An expression of open cruelty could be challenged. An expression of serene composure, identical to the one she wore when the placement was correct, left no surface to grip. The dining room doors opened. Lawrence Selborne, 5th Duke of Westmere, entered the room in evening dress, dark tailcoat, white waistcoat, cravat tied with the precision of a man whose valet had been with him since Eton. He was tall, dark-haired, 31 years old, and possessed of a face that revealed very little under ordinary circumstances and nothing at all when he wished it so. He had his mother's bone structure and his father's silence, and he used both with an economy that made drawing rooms difficult and parliamentary committees easier. He paused inside the doorway. His gaze moved down the table, the family places, the guests, his mother at the foot, and then continued, past the apern, past the shift from upholstered chairs to plain oak, to the far end where his wife sat between his housekeeper and his steward, eating soup. He looked at his mother. The dowager met his gaze with perfect equanimity. Her chin did not move. Her hands remained folded in her lap. She had anticipated this moment, had, in fact, designed the entire evening around it, because the purpose of the arrangement was not merely to humiliate Francis. It was to force her son into a public confrontation, to make him choose, in front of guests and staff alike, between correcting his mother and accepting the placement. If he corrected her, he would fracture the household's authority. If he accepted it, he would confirm Francis's position as someone who could be moved at his mother's discretion. Either way, the dowager won. The Duke said nothing. He crossed to his place at the head of the table. He stood behind his chair for a moment, his hands resting on its back, and the room waited. Lord Ashton with his wineglass half raised, Lady Ashton with her spoon suspended, Gresham at the sideboard with the claret decanter, Mrs. Ord with her eyes fixed on her plate, Palliser with his jaw set, and Frances at the far end, not looking at him at all, but holding her spoon with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in the room would ever know. The Duke lifted his chair. He did not scrape it back. He did not signal a footman. He placed both hands on the carved oak arms of the chair that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, and he lifted it clear of the floor, and he carried it. The dining room at Brindle Park was 38 feet long. The Duke carried his chair the full length of it, past Lord Ashton, who set down his wineglass, past Lady Ashton, who pressed her napkin to her mouth, past Sir Philip Carew, who turned in his seat to watch with the undisguised fascination of a man who has just been given a story he will dine out on for a decade, past the apern with its cascading arrangement of hothouse roses, past the invisible boundary where the upholstered chairs gave way to oak, past the place where the china changed from the Sevres service to the household Wedgwood. He set the chair down beside Francis. The sound it made against the floor, a single definitive contact of oak on oak, was the loudest thing in the room. He sat. He unfolded his napkin. He placed it in his lap with the same unhurried precision his wife had used, and he turned to the nearest footman, who stood frozen with a tureen of soup and an expression suggesting he had briefly forgotten both his name and his occupation, and said, "I will have the soup, Jennings." Jennings served the soup. His hands trembled, but he did not spill. The Duke began to eat. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at the family guests, who sat in a configuration of shock that ranged from Lady Ashton's wide-eyed silence to Sir Philip's barely suppressed admiration. He looked at his wife, and he said, in the same tone he would have used at any table in any room in any house in England, "I understand the garden has been giving some difficulty with the south border." Palliser mentioned the drainage. Frances set down her spoon. She looked at him. Really looked, for the first time since he had entered the room, and whatever passed between them in that glance was private, untranslatable, belonging to the language that exists only between two people who are learning, with difficulty and against opposition, to build something together in a house that does not yet feel like theirs. "The clay is too dense," she said. "I spoke with Hewson this morning. He believes a gravel trench along the lower terrace would resolve it if you are willing." "I am willing. It would require moving the rose bed." "Then we shall move the rose bed." They spoke about drainage. They spoke about the curate her father had recently engaged at St. Dunstan's, a young man of more enthusiasm than ability who had delivered a sermon on Leviticus that had lasted 47 minutes and left the congregation in a state of theological exhaustion. They spoke about a letter Frances had received from her brother at Cambridge, who was reading Aquinas and finding him, in his words, beautifully impossible. They did not speak about the seating arrangement. They did not speak about the dowager. They did not speak about what the Duke had just done, because what the Duke had just done did not require speech. It was complete in itself, a sentence written in oaken silence that would never need to be said aloud. At one point during the second course, a roast fowl with sauce that the cook had prepared with particular care, knowing the guests, Frances turned to Mrs. Ord and asked with genuine interest whether the still-room had produced enough lavender water for the autumn. Mrs. Ord, who had not been asked a direct question at this table by anyone above the rank of steward in 11 years, answered that it had not, that the summer had been too wet, and that she had been considering whether to purchase additional supplies or from the apothecary in Harrowfield. The Duke listened to this exchange with the attentive silence of a man who has just discovered that his household contains conversations he has never heard, and when Mrs. Ord mentioned the apothecary's prices, he said, "Have Palliser arrange an account. The still-room should not be constrained by a poor season." Mrs. Ord thanked him. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. Jennings, the footman, served the third course with hands that had ceased trembling and a posture that had subtly altered. He stood straighter at the lower end of the table than he had ever stood at the upper, as though the Duke's presence had recalibrated his understanding of where formality was owed. The other footman, Davies, followed his lead, and by the time the pudding was laid, the apricot tart from the estate's glasshouse, the service at the lower end of the table was indistinguishable from the service at a state dinner. Mrs. Ord ate her dinner. For the first 3 courses, her throat was so tight that swallowing required conscious effort because she understood, with the understanding of a woman who had managed a household through one duke's death and another's grief and a dowager's long, unchallenged reign, that she was witnessing something that would change the architecture of the house more thoroughly than any renovation. Palliser ate steadily beside her, his expression unreadable, but when the Duke asked him about the drainage, he answered with a fluency and a warmth that Mrs. Ord had never heard from him at this table. He had always taken his supper at the lower end in careful silence, eating efficiently, speaking only when addressed by Gresham. Now the Duke of Westmere sat beside him and asked about gravel and clay with genuine interest, and Palliser, grave, careful Palliser, found himself explaining the problem of the south border with something approaching animation. At the foot of the family table, the dowager ate nothing. Her plate was served and removed untouched. Her wine-glass remained full. Her posture did not alter by a single degree, and her expression held its perfect composure. But Mrs. Ord, who had watched this woman for 11 years, saw the stillness for what it was, the absolute immobility of someone who has miscalculated and knows it and will not, cannot, permit the knowledge to reach her face. The dowager had designed the evening as a trap with 2 jaws. Her son had walked between them both. He had neither corrected her nor accepted the placement. He had simply moved. Not his wife, not the table, not the household order, but himself, and in doing so he had rendered the entire machinery of her arrangement meaningless. The insult to Frances remained visible. There was her place card. There was the Wedgwood china. There was the housekeeper's seat beside her. But the Duke's presence at his wife's side transformed the meaning of everything around it. The lower end of the table was no longer the margin. It was, for this evening, the head. Lady Ashton attempted conversation with Lord Ashton in a whisper that carried further than she intended. Sir Philip Carew ate with evident enjoyment, watching the far end of the table with the expression of a man at the theater. His wife studied her plate. Lord Ashton drank steadily. No one addressed the dowager. This, more than anything, was the wound. not the public nature of her son's gesture, though that was considerable, and she understood with cold clarity that Sir Philip would ensure the story reached every drawing room in the county within the week, not the failure of her strategy, though that too was a blow she would feel for months. The wound was the silence. The Dowager Duchess of Westmere, who had governed this table and this house and this family for 23 years, through the precise calibration Rolfine of seating and invitation and omission, sat at the foot of her own table and was not spoken to for the duration of a 4-course dinner. The meal lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Francis ate every course. The Duke ate every course. They spoke to each other and to Mrs. Ord and to Palliser, and once to Jennings, who had recovered his composure sufficiently to answer a question about whether the apricots in the tart had come from the estate's own glasshouse, which they had. They did not speak to the Dowager, not because they had agreed not to. There had been no agreement, no plan, no whispered strategy in the corridor beforehand, but because the distance between the two ends of the table was now, for the first time, a distance the Dowager had created and could not cross. When the ladies withdrew, Francis rose and walked to the drawing room with Lady Ashton and Lady Carew, and the Dowager walked behind them, and no one held the door for her because Gresham, who had watched the evening unfold with the professional neutrality of a man whose loyalties had just been reorganized, was attending to the port at the Duke's end, which was the servants' end, which was now simply the end where the Duke sat. Mrs. Ord cleared the lower table herself that evening, though it was not her duty. She stacked the Wedgwood plates and carried them to the kitchen passage, and when she reached the scullery and set them down beside the basin, she stood for a moment with her hands flat on the scrubbed wood and breathed. Palliser found her there. He stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back and said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "She will not forgive it." "No, Mrs." Ord said. "He knows that." "Yes." Palliser nodded. He looked at the stacked plates, and his expression shifted, not to anything so demonstrative as a smile, but to something that lived in the same parish. "The drainage on the south border does want attention," he said, and left. In the days that followed, the household rearranged itself with the slow, deliberate inevitability of furniture being moved in a room whose owner has changed. The Dowager did not leave Brindell Park. That would have been an admission of defeat, and she was not a woman who admitted defeat. But she retreated. The morning room, which she had occupied each day from 9 until noon for 8 years, she yielded to Francis without announcement, simply ceased to appear there one Tuesday morning, taking her correspondence instead to the smaller parlor at the back of the house that overlooked the kitchen garden and received no afternoon light. Francis noticed. She said nothing. She began using the morning room as her own, writing letters to her father, reviewing the household accounts with Mrs. Ord, receiving the tenants' wives who came with questions about the school and the lying-in fund and the arrangements for the autumn harvest supper. She conducted these meetings with the same grave courtesy she had shown Lady Ashton's milliner complaints and the tenants' wives, who had been uncertain of their new duchess and frankly terrified of the Dowager, found themselves telling her things they had not intended to say, and leaving with the peculiar sensation of having been thoroughly and respectfully heard. The keys were the final concession. The Dowager had held the household keys since her husband's death, the heavy iron ring that opened the wine cellar, the still room, the linen closets, the silver safe. It was the symbol of domestic authority, more meaningful in the daily life of a great house than any title or courtesy. 3 weeks after the dinner, Mrs. Ord found them hanging on the hook inside the morning room door, the morning room that was now Francis's, with no note and no explanation. The Dowager had not handed them to anyone. She had simply placed them where they would be found by the person who now required them, and this act of relinquishment, performed in private and without witness, was perhaps the closest the Dowager Duchess of Westmere ever came to an acknowledgment that she had been wrong. The Duke observed these changes from the careful distance of a man who understood that what he had done at the dinner table was a beginning, not an ending. He did not attempt to banish his mother or to humiliate her further. He simply continued to make clear, through 100 small daily choices, where his loyalty lay. The consultation of Francis on matters of the estate, the morning walks they began to take together along the south border where the drainage work was proceeding, the quiet evenings in the library where she read aloud from her brother's letters, and he sat with his own correspondence and looked up more often than he looked down. He had not planned the chair. He told her this weeks later on one of their morning walks, when the October mist was lifting from the lower fields and the sound of Hewson's men digging the gravel trench carried faintly across the park. He had not entered the dining room with a strategy or a speech prepared. He had entered the dining room and seen his wife eating soup among his servants, and something had settled in him. Not anger, not outrage, but a clarity so complete and so calm that the action had followed as naturally as breathing. He could no more have sat at the head of that table while Francis sat at the foot than he could have eaten his dinner with his hands. It was simply not possible. The geometry was wrong, and he had corrected it the only way that did not require him to raise his voice or diminish his mother or make his wife into a cause rather than a person. Francis had listened to this with her hand in the crook of his arm and her gaze on the line of elms along the drive, and she had said, "I would have been all right, you know, at the lower end." "I know," the Duke said. "That is precisely why I could not leave you there." The Dowager watched all of this. She was not a stupid woman. She was, in fact, considerably more intelligent than her son gave her credit for, and she understood with perfect clarity that the campaign she had waged against Francis Thurlow was over, not because she had been defeated in argument or confronted with ultimatums or threatened with exile, because her son had picked up a chair. She had spent 23 years governing through arrangement, through the placement of objects and people, and silences in configurations that served her authority. Her son had answered with a single rearrangement so simple and so total that it could not be countered. One could argue with words. One could not argue with a man eating his dinner. Sir Philip Carew did as the Dowager had foreseen, tell the story. He told it at the Midsummer Assembly at Harrowfield, and again at a house party in Derbyshire, and it spread through the county with the steady thoroughness of a well-made rumor. But the story, as Sir Philip told it, was not a story of humiliation. It was a story of a man who loved his wife, and the telling of it did more for the Duke's standing in society than 3 seasons of careful hospitality could have achieved. Women who had dismissed Francis Thurlow as a clergyman's nobody began to call at Brindle Park. Men who had considered the Duke cold and difficult revised their assessments. The chair became, in the folklore of the county, a love story, which it was, though not in the way Sir Philip's audiences imagined. It was not the love of grand gestures and passionate declarations. It was the love of a man who saw his wife seated in the wrong place and moved himself to the right one. The south border was drained by August. The rosebed was relocated to the west terrace, where it received better afternoon light and bloomed with a vigor that surprised even Hewson, who had been gardener at Brindle Park for 30 years and was not easily surprised by roses. Francis's brother completed his studies at Cambridge and took a living in Norfolk, and when he visited Brindle Park at Christmas, he found his sister presiding over a household that ran with quiet efficiency and a dining table where the seating had been permanently rearranged. The Dowager still occupied her chair at the foot. The Duke sat at the head. Francis sat at his right hand, in the place that had always been the Duchess's, on the upholstered chair that the Dowager had occupied for 8 years after her husband's death and relinquished, without comment, on the morning after the dinner. No one had asked her to move. The chair had simply appeared in its correct position when Francis came down to breakfast the following day, and Gresham, when she looked at him, had offered nothing more than the suggestion of a bow and the information that her tea was ready. The Dowager lived at Brindle Park for 6 more years. She never left. That was not her way. But the household understood, with the wordless comprehension that staff develop in houses where power shifts slowly, that the center of gravity had moved. Mrs. Ord took her instructions from the Duchess. Palliser reported to the Duke and, increasingly, to Francis, whose understanding of drainage and crop rotation and the structural needs of tenant cottages had been honed by a childhood in a rectory where the clergyman was also by default the village's councillor, surveyor, and occasional engineer. The Dowager took her meals with the family. She sat in her place. She spoke when addressed and offered opinions on matters of household management that were received with courtesy and, when sound, adopted. She was not banished, she was not punished, she was simply no longer the authority, and she bore this diminishment with the rigid composure of a woman who understood that the alternative, loss of composure, was the one thing she could not afford. Years passed, the estate prospered. Frances bore a son, Martin, named for her father, who traveled from Hartwell to perform the christening, and stood at the font in the chapel at Brindle Park with his worn prayer book and his spectacles and his voice that shook only once, at the end, when he said the child's name. The Duke stood beside his wife and held her hand throughout the service, which was not customary, and the Dowager, seated in the front pew, watched with an expression that contained, if Mrs. Ord read it correctly, and she believed she did, something that was not warmth exactly, but was perhaps the first distant cousin of acceptance. Reverend Thurlow stayed a week. He walked the grounds with his daughter each morning and pronounced the south border much improved. He discussed theology with the Duke over port and found him, to his private satisfaction, a man of more depth than his silences suggested. He played with his grandson on the library carpet and read him passages from the Psalms in a voice calibrated for infants, which was to say, gentle beyond all recognition. On his last evening he sat with Frances in the morning room, with her mother's watercolor now hanging above the fireplace where it caught the light, and he said, "You are well, then?" "I am well, Papa." He nodded. He looked at the room, at the books on the shelves, at the small writing desk where her correspondence was stacked in the orderly manner she had inherited from him, and he said, "Your mother would have liked the roses on the West Terrace." "Yes," Frances said, "I believe she would." He returned to Hartwell the following morning. The Duke's carriage took him, which was a kindness the Reverend had not requested, and which moved him, privately, more than any other gesture of his son-in-law's regard. The dining room table at Brindle Park still ran the full length of the room, 38 feet of dark oak, polished each Thursday by the housemaids until it held the light like water. On formal evenings, when the family dined with guests and the senior staff took their supper at the lower end, the seating followed the arrangement that had been in place since the night the Duke carried his chair. The Duchess at his right hand, the Dowager at the foot, the guests distributed according to rank and precedent, and the particular social geometry that Mrs. Ord had, over the years, made her own quiet art. But once each year on the anniversary of that first dinner, the Duke and Duchess dined at the lower end of the table. They did not announce this, they did not explain it. They simply appeared in their evening clothes and took their seats beside Mrs. Ord and Palliser and ate their dinner and spoke about the garden, and the household understood, as households do, that some things are not traditions but sacraments, acts of remembrance too important for words and too simple to require them. The Dowager, on these evenings, ate at the foot of the family table in her customary silence, and if she felt, watching her son carry his chair past her for the 38th time, with the same unhurried calm he had shown on the first evening, if she felt something shift behind the architecture of her composure, some recognition of what she had lost and what she had, by her own arrangement, given him the means to find, she did not show it. That was her way. It had always been her way. But Mrs. Ord, clearing the plates afterward, noticed that the Dowager's wineglass on these evenings was always empty. She drank it, every drop, and whether that was grief or penance or simply the need for something to do with her hands while her son ate among the servants by choice, Mrs. Ord never asked, and the Dowagers never said. Some arrangements speak for themselves. They arrive here, like a chair drawn closer when no one expected it, whenever they are ready.